The Dark Bible. A short history of the Bible. The stories of the Bible evolved slowly over centuries before the existence of orthodox religions. Many believe cults spread stories and myths probably handed down by oral tradition from generation to generation, before people wrote them down. Many of the stories originally came from Egyptian and Sumerian cults. All of these early religions practiced polytheism, including the early Hebrews. Some of the oldest records of the stories that later entered the Old Testament came from thousands of small cylinder seals depicting creation stories, excavated from the Mesopotamia period. These early artifacts and artworks, dated as early as 2500 BC, established the basis for the Garden of Eden stories at least 1,000 years before it impacted Hebrew mythology. Virtually every human civilization in the Middle East, before and through biblical times, practiced some form of female goddess worship. Archaeologists have confirmed that the earliest law, government, medicine, agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, wheeled vehicles, ceramics, textiles and written language had initially developed in societies that worshipped the goddess. Later the goddesses became more warlike with the influence of the northern invaders who slowly replaced the goddesses with their mountain male war gods. So why doesn't the Bible mention anything about the goddess? In fact it does, but in disguise from converting the name of the goddesses to masculine terms. Many times gods in the Bible refers to goddesses. Ashtaroth, or Asherah, named of masculine gender, for example, actually refers to Astarte the great goddess. The Old Testament doesn't even have a word for goddess. The goddesses, sometimes, refers to the Hebrew word Elohim, masculine plural form, which later religionists mistranslated into the singular God. The Bible authors converted the ancient goddess symbols into icons of evil. As such, the snake, serpents, tree of knowledge, horns, of the bull, became associated with Satan. The end result gave women the status of inferiority, a result which we still see to this day. The Old Testament consists of a body of literature spread over a period from approximately 1450 BC to 200 BC. There exists no original writings of the Old Testament. There does exist, however, hundreds of fragments from copies that became the Old Testament. These fragments consist of cuneiform tablets, papyrus paper, leather etchings and the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. The scribes of the Old Testament wrote in classical Hebrew except for some portions written in Aramaic. The traditional Hebrew scribes wrote the texts with consonants, but the rabbis later added vowels for verbal pronouncing. Of course the rabbis did their best in choosing the vowels that they thought gave the words their proper meaning and pronouncement. In the 2nd century CE, or even earlier, the rabbis compiled a text from manuscripts, as had survived the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and on this basis they established the traditional or Masoretic text, so called from the Hebrew word Masorah. This text incorporated the mistakes of generations of copyists, and in spite of the care bestowed on it, many errors of later copyists also found their way into it. The earliest surviving manuscripts of this text date from the 9th to 11th centuries CE. It comes mostly from these texts which religionists have used for the present Old Testament translations. The New Testament has even fewer surviving texts. Scholars think that not until years after Jesus' alleged death that its authors wrote the Gospels. There exists no evidence that the New Testament came from the purported original apostles or anyone else that had seen the alleged Jesus. Although the oldest surviving Christian texts came from Paul, he had never seen the earthly Jesus. There occurs nothing in Paul's letters that either hints at the existence of the Gospels or even of a need for such memoirs of Jesus Christ. The oldest copy of the New Testament yet found consists of a tiny fragment from the Gospel of John. Scholars dated the little flake of papyrus from the period style of its handwriting to around the first half of the 2nd century CE. The language of most of the New Testament consists of Old Greek. Interestingly, there existed many competing Christian cults in the early years, after Jesus' alleged death. Some sects saw the universe in dualisms of goodness and sin, of light and darkness, God and the devil. Other Christian sects performed odd rituals, some of which involved the swallowing of semen, thought of as a sacred substance. Many other Christians also wrote mystical stories, and by the 2nd century there existed more than a dozen Gospels, along with a whole library of other texts. These include letters of Jesus to 4 Kings, letters of Paul to Aristotle, and histories of the disciples. In one of these secret Gospels, it describes Jesus taking naked young men off to secret initiation rites in the Garden of Gethsemane. There lived Christian Gnostics, knowers who believed that the church itself derived from the devil to keep man from God and from realizing his true nature. In those first centuries of Christianity, orthodoxy did not exist, and when an organized Orthodox church finally came, it got defined, almost inadvertently, in argument against many of the Gnostic sects. So the idea of the Bible as a single, sacred, unalterable corpus of texts began in heresy and later extended and used by churchmen in their efforts to define orthodoxy. One of the Bible's most influential editors, Irenaeus of Lyon, decided that there should only exist 4 Gospels, like the 4 zones of the world, the 4 wines, the 4 divisions of man's estate, and the 4 forms of the first living creatures, the line of Mark, the calf of Luke, the man of Matthew, and the eagle of John. In a single stroke, Irenaeus had delineated the sacred book of the Christian Church and left out the other Gospels. Irenaeus also wrote what Christianity did not include, and in this way Christianity became an orthodox faith. A work of Irenaeus, Against the Heresies, became the starting point for later inquisitions. There has existed over 100 different versions of the Bible, written in most of the languages of the time including Greek, Hebrew and Latin. Some versions left out certain biblical stories and others contained added stories. The completed versions of the Old and New Testament probably got finished at around 200–300 CE, although many disputed the authenticity of some books which later ended up as apocrypha, uncanonical or of questionable authorship. For example, the book of Ecclesiasticus appears in the Catholic Bible but not in Protestant versions. At around 405 CE, Jerome, Eusebius Hieronymus, finished translating all the Old and New Testament books into Latin, Vulgate Bible, which provided the Roman Catholic Church added power. The Vulgate Bible